There's a trader out there right now, probably more than one, who has read every book, studied every chart pattern, back-tested their system until the data was exhausted, watched hundreds of hours of market analysis, passed their series exams, built a spreadsheet tracking every trade they've ever made with columns for setup, entry, exit, rationale, outcome, and lessons learned. And they're still losing money, not because they're doing it wrong, not because the books were bad or the patterns were false or the system was broken, because intelligence, real, genuine, sophisticated intelligence, is not the edge most traders think it is. In fact, and this is the thing that took me a long time to sit with, intelligence in the wrong configuration is not neutral. It's not just unhelpful. It can actively work against you. It can make you worse. It can take a trader who has every analytical tool they need to succeed and turn those tools into instruments of self-destruction. Jesse Livermore watched this happen, repeatedly, to brilliant people, to people whose analysis was genuinely superior, whose understanding of markets was deep and hard-won, whose track records in certain conditions were exceptional. And he watched those same people make mistakes so basic, so obvious in hindsight, so completely at odds with everything they knew, that observers on the outside couldn't understand how someone so smart could do something so clearly wrong. Livermore understood how, because he had done it himself. And what he figured out about why smart traders make the dumbest mistakes, not occasionally, not as a fluke but as a consistent, predictable, almost inevitable pattern, is one of the most important things anyone has ever figured out about markets and human nature. That's what this episode is about, not how to be smarter, how to stop letting your intelligence work against you. Let's start with a specific kind of trader. You probably know this person. You might be this person, at least in certain moments under certain conditions. This trader is genuinely good, not self-deluded good, actually good. They can look at a chart and identify the structure clearly. They understand macro conditions. They know when a setup is clean and when it isn't. They've put in the time. They've done the work. When they're operating at their best and when the conditions are right and their head is clear and they're fully in the zone, they're impressive to watch. And then something happens. It could be a losing streak. It could be a period of unusual market volatility. It could be a single bad trade that was larger than it should have been. It could be something completely unrelated to markets, stress at home, a health scare, a disruption to routine, that bleeds into their trading. Whatever it is, something shifts. And suddenly this trader, this genuinely capable, analytically sophisticated trader, starts making decisions that seem almost inexplicable. They hold a losing position days past the point where any rational assessment would have exited it. They double down on a trade that's clearly broken because they can't let go of the thesis. They abandon a system that was working because 2 or 3 consecutive losses shook their confidence. They take a position that doesn't meet their own criteria because they've been on the sidelines too long and the itch to trade became unbearable. From the outside, watching someone you know to be smart make these decisions, the natural reaction is confusion. How does someone who knows better do something they clearly know is wrong? Livermore spent his career answering that question, and his answer, the answer that runs through everything he wrote and everything he did, is both simpler and more unsettling than most people want to hear. Intelligence doesn't protect you from bad decisions in markets. Under the right conditions, it makes them worse. Here's why. And I want to be precise about this because the mechanism matters. When you're in a losing trade, when the position is moving against you and the pressure is building, and the decision about what to do is sitting right in front of you, your brain is not operating in the same state it was in when you did your analysis. Before the trade, you were in an analytical state, calm, objective, evaluating probabilities, weighing evidence, making a reasoned judgment. Now you're in a threatened state. The money is real, the loss is real, the ego is on the line. And the part of your brain that handles threat, the part that was designed over millions of years of evolution to deal with predators and physical danger and social exclusion, that part has taken the wheel. And it has one priority: protect what you have. Not protect your capital, Protect your sense of self. Protect your identity as a trader who makes good decisions. Protect the narrative that your analysis was correct. Protect you from the social and psychological experience of being wrong. This is where intelligence becomes dangerous, because an average intelligence faced with this internal pressure might simply freeze, might be unable to construct a compelling enough reason to stay in the trade, might exit because the discomfort is too much and there's no sophisticated counter-argument available. A high intelligence in this same moment does something different. It goes to work. It constructs, it builds, it generates, quickly, fluently, convincingly, an elaborate and internally consistent case for why the trade is not actually broken, why the loss is temporary, why the analysis is still valid, why this specific situation is different from the general rule that says exit here. The smarter you are, the better the case you can build, the more persuasive the internal argument, the more convincing the narrative that keeps you in a trade you should be out of. Livermore called this the speculator's greatest trap, not ignorance, not stupidity. Intelligence deployed in the service of self-deception. He had a name for the process. He called it hoping against the tape. The tape, the actual real-time price action, is telling you one thing. Your intelligent mind is constructing an argument for why the tape is wrong. And the argument is good enough, sophisticated enough, internally consistent enough that you believe it, not because you're fooling yourself deliberately, because the argument is genuinely convincing, because your brain is genuinely capable of building it, because the need to protect yourself from being wrong has recruited your intelligence into its service, and your intelligence is very good at its job. He described watching this in other traders, men whose analytical abilities he respected genuinely, and the thing that struck him most was not the mistakes themselves, it was the quality of the justifications. These were not simple, obvious rationalizations. These were sophisticated, nuanced, carefully constructed arguments for why a clearly losing trade should be held, arguments that incorporated macro context and industry analysis and technical factors and historical precedent. Arguments that, if you heard them without knowing the outcome, might sound genuinely reasonable. That's the tell. When the justification for staying in a bad trade starts sounding like real analysis, that's when you know the intelligence has been fully captured by the ego. Because real analysis is done before the trade, in a calm state, without money on the line, without the need for a specific outcome. What happens after you're in the trade, when the position is losing and the pressure is building, is almost never real analysis. It's defense, dressed up to look like analysis, using the vocabulary and the structure of analysis, but serving a completely different function. Livermore understood this distinction because he had been on both sides of it. He had done the real analysis that produced his greatest trades, and he had done the defensive pseudo-analysis that produced his worst ones. And he had lived with the cost of the difference long enough to know exactly what it felt like from the inside. They feel identical. That's the problem. In the moment, genuine reconsideration of a trade and ego-driven defense of a losing position feel the same. Both feel like thinking. Both have the internal texture of analysis. Both produce conclusions that feel arrived at rather than constructed. The only way to tell the difference, and the only reliable method Livermore found, was the timestamp. If the thinking happened before the trade, with no money at risk, it was probably real. If it's happening now in response to a position moving against you, with real dollars on the line, and your identity as a trader attached to the outcome, treat it with deep suspicion, not as analysis, as a symptom. There's a specific mistake pattern that Livermore identified, one that he saw repeatedly, in himself and in others, and that he believed was uniquely common among the most intelligent traders. He called it the brilliant exception. Here's how it works. You have a rule, a real rule, not a guideline, something you've established through experience and testing and honest evaluation of your own trading, something you know to be true about how markets work and how you work best within them. And then a situation arises that seems different, that seems like it might be the exception the rule wasn't designed for, where your intelligence, genuinely engaged, genuinely analyzing, generates a compelling case for why this specific situation justifies departing from the rule. The case is often good. Sometimes it's excellent. And because it's good, because it has the quality of real thinking rather than obvious rationalization, you let it override the rule. And the result is almost always the same. The rule was right. The exception was wrong. The brilliant case for why this time was different was brilliant in construction and wrong in conclusion, and you pay the price that the rule was designed to prevent you from paying. Livermore watched this happen so many times, watched intelligent traders construct such genuinely impressive cases for why the exception applied, that he arrived at a conviction that sounds almost counterintuitive. The better the case for an exception, the more suspicious you should be of it. Because a genuinely good case for breaking a rule is a sign that your intelligence is fully engaged in the project of self-deception. The sophistication of the argument is evidence of the sophistication of the need. And the need, the desperate, ego-protective need to not be wrong, is at its most sophisticated, its most resourceful, its most persuasive when the stakes are highest. When the stakes are highest is exactly when you most need to trust the rule. Not because rules are infallible, not because exceptions never exist, but because the moment when you're most convinced the exception applies is the moment when your judgment is least reliable, when the pressure is greatest, when the need for a specific outcome is strongest, when the intelligence has been most thoroughly recruited into the service of protection rather than truth. The rule was made in a calm moment, by a version of you that wasn't under pressure, that wasn't defending an open position, that wasn't protecting an identity. Trust that version. I want to tell you about a pattern Livermore described in his own trading that illustrates this better than any theoretical explanation. He called it the cycle of the gifted trader. It goes like this. The gifted trader, and Livermore was clear that this pattern was specifically associated with above-average ability, not average ability, develops a genuine edge through hard work and honest self-examination. They refine their methodology. They build rules that reflect what they've learned about markets and about their own psychology. And they start to produce results, good results, real results, the kind that come from a sound process operating correctly in favorable conditions. And then the results produce something unexpected. They produce confidence, real, earned, evidence-based confidence. The trader has genuinely performed. The methodology has genuinely worked. The confidence is not delusional. It's a reasonable response to a real track record. But confidence changes something subtle in the way the gifted trader operates. It changes the relationship with the rules. Before the track record, the rules were a lifeline. They were the structure that the trader held onto when uncertainty was high, and the temptation to deviate was strong. The rules were bigger than the trader's in-the-moment judgment, because the trader was humble enough to know that in-the-moment judgment was unreliable. After the track record, the rules become suggestions. Not consciously, the trader would never frame it that way. But in practice, in the small daily decisions, the rules start to bend. The criteria get loosened. The exceptions start to appear more frequently. Because the trader now has evidence that their judgment is good. Evidence that they can read markets. Evidence that trusting themselves produces results. The confidence is not wrong, but the conclusion it generates, that their in-the-moment judgment is now reliable enough to override the rules, is catastrophically wrong. Because the rules were not designed for when your judgment is good. They were designed for when your judgment is compromised, for when the pressure is high and the stakes are real and the ego has recruited the intelligence for defensive purposes. And success doesn't eliminate those conditions, it amplifies them. Because now there's more to protect, a bigger account, a stronger reputation, a larger identity as a successful trader. The ego has more at stake. The intelligence has more to protect. And when the inevitable losing period arrives, as it always does, in every trader's career, no matter how sound the methodology, the sophisticated defense mechanisms have never been better resourced. Livermore lived this cycle more than once. He knew it from the inside, in a way that very few people have ever understood it from the outside. And his conclusion was not that success was dangerous, not that you should fear your own winning streaks. His conclusion was specific and practical. The rules matter most when they're hardest to follow. And they're hardest to follow when you've been winning. Let me bring this somewhere concrete. Because everything I've described so far, the intelligence deployed in self-deception, the brilliant exception, the cycle of the gifted trader, all of it converges on a single practical question. What do you do about it? Livermore's answer was not be less smart, obviously, and it was not trust your rules blindly and never think. He was far too sophisticated for that. His answer was about the relationship between thinking and deciding, specifically about when thinking should inform a decision and when it should be viewed with suspicion. He believed that genuine analysis, the kind that improves your trading, happens before the trade, in a neutral state, with no position on, with no money at risk, with no ego invested in a particular outcome. In that state, think as hard as you want. Use all the intelligence available. Build the most sophisticated analysis you can. Test it against every counter-argument. Stress test the thesis. Look for the ways you could be wrong. Do all of that work in that state, and then make your decision. Enter or don't enter. And if you enter, define the conditions, the specific price levels, the specific behaviors that would tell you the thesis is wrong. Write those conditions down. Commit to them. Not as guidelines, as the non-negotiable terms of the trade. Then when the trade is on, when money is at risk and the position is moving, your job changes. You are no longer an analyst. You are an executor. Your job is to watch the price action against the conditions you predefined and to act on what you see, not to think, not to analyze, not to build new cases, to watch and to act. If the price does what the pre-trade analysis said would invalidate the thesis, you exit. Not because the in-the-moment analysis says to exit, because the pre-trade analysis, made by the version of you that wasn't under pressure, said to exit. The in-the-moment thinking gets noticed, gets acknowledged, and then gets set aside because it's not trustworthy right now, not because you're not smart, because the conditions that compromise judgment are present, because the ego is on the line, because the intelligence has been recruited for purposes other than truth. This is the framework. It sounds simple. It requires enormous discipline to maintain, and the discipline is hardest to maintain precisely when the intelligence is most convincingly arguing for an exception. There's something Livermore wrote about the emotional experience of following this framework, of watching your pre-trade conditions get hit and executing the exit even as your in-the-moment mind is building a case against it, that I find deeply honest. He said it never felt good. Not even when it turned out to be right. Not even when you exited at the predefined level and the stock continued to fall and the exit was vindicated in the most obvious way possible. There was always a moment, right at the exit, right when you closed the position, where the doubt was real, where the voice was loudest, where the brilliant exception seemed most compelling. He said the traders who could execute through that moment, who could feel the full force of the intelligent doubt and act on the pre-trade commitment anyway, those were the traders who lasted. Not because they were smarter, not because their in-the-moment analysis was better, but because they had built a relationship with their own psychology that was honest enough to recognize the doubt for what it was. Not analysis, resistance. The resistance of an ego that doesn't want to be wrong, dressed in the vocabulary of analysis, speaking in the voice of intelligence, but serving the purposes of self-protection. Recognizing that resistance, feeling it fully and acting against it anyway, is not an intellectual achievement. It's an emotional one. It's the product of enough self-knowledge built through enough honest examination of your own patterns that you can tell the difference between genuine reconsideration and sophisticated rationalization. That self-knowledge is what Livermore kept rebuilding throughout his career. Not market knowledge, not analytical frameworks. The specific, hard-won, deeply personal knowledge of how his own mind worked under pressure and how to work with it rather than being worked by it. Here's what I want you to take into your next trading session. Not a system, not a rule, a question. When you're in a trade that's moving against you, when the voice starts up, when the intelligent case for staying in begins to build, ask yourself one question: when did I think of this? Not is this analysis good, not is this argument convincing, not could this be right. When did I think of this? If the answer is before the trade, if this is something you considered in your pre-trade analysis, in a neutral state without money on the line, then it deserves weight. It's real thinking. If the answer is right now, if this argument appeared after the position started losing, in response to the loss in the context of an open trade with real money at risk, treat it with deep suspicion, not because it's necessarily wrong, but because the conditions under which it arose are exactly the conditions that compromise the reliability of your judgment. The timing of the thought is the tell. Smart traders make dumb mistakes not because they stop thinking. They make them because they think too well in the wrong moments, in service of the wrong purposes. The fix is not thinking less. It's knowing when to trust your thinking and when to trust the framework you built when your thinking was at its most honest. Livermore figured this out across 40 years of the most expensive education any trader has ever received. The lesson is right there, waiting for anyone willing to receive it honestly. If this series is giving you something real, if you're finding that the way Livermore thought about markets is changing the way you think about your own trading, then stay with us. LC Books and Life is built for exactly this depth. Every episode in this Jesse Livermore series goes into a different dimension of what he understood: trading psychology, risk management, patience, probability, market reading. And every episode is built for the trader who is serious about the inner game, not just the outer one. 50 episodes, one of the most important minds in market history. Everything he learned about why traders succeed and fail, and what to do about it. Subscribe so you don't miss one. Livermore's books are in the description. How to Trade in Stocks and Reminiscences of a Stock Operator. If you haven't read them, start there. If you have, read them again after this series. They'll hit differently. See you in the next episode.